What is up, YouTube? Welcome back to the channel. It is Aaron, and I'm here today with some friends. We're going to be doing a breakdown video for the Justice Hunters format going into YCS Vancouver. We're going to be doing a breakdown. I have a friend of mine over here, Alex Robertson, trying to get back into competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Want to introduce yourself? Former
Yeah, I'm Alex
Disciples.
Robertson from the Disciples
Yes,
over here in the UK. Aaron's pretty good at Yu-Gi-Oh, so I'm hoping he can teach me a thing or two here.
that is the hope. And I brought my friend in Rehan. Say hello real quick.
Hi everyone, my name's Rehan.
Yeah, so he is one of the guys in the Secret 7 testing server that I'm in, and he is one of the guys that has helped me develop this breakdown sheet. We're going to go over deck lists of all the top decks in the format, and then we are going to have a discussion over how we came to this conclusion of all the percentages that you see on the screen. So yeah, first things first, we have we should start with the old decks real quick. We've got Ryzeal, Mitsurugi, and Maliss. We have just a normal list. I think this is the one from top 16 of EUWCQ. Pretty standard ratios. It plays Star Ryzeal and 7th Tachyon. You can play something similar to the Cormac Adams, who is on Disciples and won UK Nationals. He played a very similar list between Nationals and the WCQ, where he played pre-prep. You have a couple different options there. With Droll being somewhat less prevalent in the format, I think this deck is still very strong, obviously. The non-engine, you have options here. You have Chummies, you have Drolls, you can play cards like Droplet. You're pretty diverse in the non-engine options you have, and then obviously you have cards like Harpies on your side, and then plenty of extra deck and side deck space for utility. And then we've got Maliss. This is a K9 Maliss deck that topped a regional over the weekend. We've got plenty of non-engine. Dominance Impulse is a fantastic card. Chummies, as always. Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, and then just a normal extra deck. He's playing Valen and Ripper for his extra deck targets. Then normal side deck stuff, including a Thrust package. Rehan, how do you think these decks are positioned going into Justice Hunters format?
I think these decks are positioned really well. I think you touched the ball on like Ryzeal Mitsurugi being really well positioned. I think a lot of the decks that I've played against in several different platforms, Prulia has largely been relegated to the side deck. I think a lot of people just see that there's no great value for Prulia, especially against like some of the newer decks like Yummy and Dracotail. And the same goes for Droll as well. Droll just isn't seeing insane value the way it was in the previous format just because of like how wide the metagame is right now. So the more that cards like those are shifted to the side deck, the more that this deck, at least Ryzeal Mitsurugi, becomes a bit more popular. And I think Malice is just probably one of the decks still that, outside of one of the new decks perhaps, that when it full combos, it likely will always win the game. So I think these two are probably top dog.
Yeah, so the way that Maliss performed so well last format is you had you only had to deal with Lancia post side, right? So like everyone had like the Drolls and the Chummies, which it played through relatively well. So if Ryzeal Mitsurugi is in the same position where like Perulia and Droll aren't in the main deck, then now your game one is super strong. And then even when there's cards like Droll and Perulia, you don't have like they're not silver bullets the same way. Like you can still end on some kind of an end board. Malice is the same way now. There's like Malice in the Underground and March here. So both of the decks can put up something modest. Then there's obviously like good trap cards like Harpies and whatever else the Malice deck is on now. Yeah, you've got Rivalry of the Warlords, which we'll get into a little bit later. The continuous trap cards making their way back into the format. So yeah, we've got the Yummy deck we'll start with. There's two different options. This is a Breaker version. This is playing Songs of the Dominator, Dominus Purge, Infinite Impermanence. And then Thrust Droplet. This is Full Breaker with Storms and Dusters. I've seen cards like Book of Eclipse. I've seen Metal Tronus. So definitely a lot of options here. Extra deck seems pretty usual. One of all the synchros. A couple different options to make Herald the Arclight, which there's only one of. I've seen between 1 and 2. And then a normal synchro package, or sorry, a link package of Anari and then 3 Snatchy. There is currently no out to Contact C in the side deck, or in the extra deck, which is not a card that I've seen too much of, so that may be something to take advantage of. And then we've obviously just got like the good side deck cards, Lancia, Fua, and then yeah, more good continuous trap cards. Metal Tronus, I assume, is for the mirror. And then, yeah, Crush card is hilarious against a deck like K9 Vanquish Soul and even something like Mitsurugi. And then the other version of Yummy, before we get into the discussion, is more hand trap focused. So this one doesn't play as many hand traps. If you've seen duelists like Steven Triff, he has a full hand trap version where it's like somewhere around 43 cards, and it has like, I think, 20 non-engine slots. All of them are hand traps. I think he plays Purge, Imperm, and then, you know, whatever, Valor, Ash, all the good cards. This one's a little more of a halfway approach where it plays Imperm and Purge. A little bit of a breaker with Thrust, Droplet, and then Engage, obviously. fantastic cards to search off of it, and then the full 9 normal summons. I've seen some lists play Pure Rice Map to increase consistency. Some of them are going down to like 2 of each and then playing Pure Rice Map because Cookie is just a way better normal summon than, or sorry, not Cookie, Cupsy is the way better normal summon of the 3. And then extra deck, something similar, no Typhon, but the second Herald, and then pretty similar side deck in terms of what it includes. Lancia, Perulia, and then Judgments for going first. How do you feel about this deck going forward, Ron?
I think it's weird because, like you said, there's like 2 variants going on right now, where there's a breaker version, and then there's one where you have the hand traps. I don't think the engine is super strong going into boards, so I think it does rely on the breakers combined with some of the power spells to push going second. But I think it's largely resilient to a lot of the common hand traps. Same with like the hand traps that were played last format. Cards like Valor, Imperm, even Nibs can sometimes not be great, and has a really good answer to Fua, where you just make a somewhat of a half board. You're backed by a decent non-engine, and then you end with like you give your opponent 1 draw and you end on somewhat of a half board. So I think it has good compromise into a lot of the non-engine answers for the format, and then the fact that it's able to be such a condensed engine that's able to fit so much non-engine, I think is like decks like these are always good in Yu-Gi-Oh! Just want to touch something upon Malice as well. That I realized is that when we looked at just the first 3 deck lists, both the 2 Yemi deck lists along with the Malice deck list, and I think we'll see this pattern in some of the other deck lists as well. If you look at the side deck, you won't see Meows in the side deck anymore. So I think that's like another card that almost bolsters Malice, with a card like Meows not being in the format. Same with Chaos Hunter, is when these cards are just entirely out of the format, your only silver bullet card now is going to be Lancia. So that just like the format being wide just bolsters Malice's position as well.
Yeah. So yeah, we've got those. We will get into the Crystron deck. This is something that I have been testing a little bit more as of late. I see it getting a little bit more popular. So instead of it being just like, I think, a 5-deck format, I think Crystron is now approaching that level of being on that same level as the rest. It's probably closer to a 6-deck format. This is a little bit different in terms of the ratios that I've seen. I generally only see 1 Tristaros. I see 3 Solfador in terms of engine ratios. I don't always see Citri. So there's definitely some variance in the deck building. We'll see it maybe get a little more ironed out over the course of time. This one topped the regional over the past weekend, if I remember correctly. Or, sorry, I take it back. Sorry, this is a little bit older, maybe no CG list. So yeah, not the list that I've been playing, but obviously just all the important pieces are there. Solfador to send your combo pieces, summonable off of Jokel. We've got Kaser, K9, and Chaotic Elements to increase the consistency. And then you have, looks like 14 non-engine slots in a 40-card deck, so pretty respectable. And then extra deck looks about normal. Samurai Destroyer is not something I've always seen. I don't know how to say this card, Quandrax, whatever it is. Card's very good whenever it goes off. And then obviously you have Ripper, Werewolf, the quick play spell in the main deck. And this side deck, I think, is just some more options. This is not a complete list. So yeah, this is, I think, a really strong deck going into the format. The K9 cards are obviously very good. And whenever you're playing a K9 mirror match, even if it's not just like Crystron K9 versus Crystron K9, if your deck has K9 cards, they interact very interestingly into each other. Just because they turn on each other, they make the games way more interactive. So I've really been enjoying the K9 cards into the format. Rohan, what do you think about the Crystron deck?
I think that's really cool. I think it was on the fringe of like the metagame last time. With the only person that I know that had success with it was like Yassine. We're still having success with this, obviously, along with Santoli. So seeing this deck be bolstered by K9 is really nice to see. And I think of the new decks, this deck actually probably benefits the most from the K9 engine just because of like how nice the synergy is when you are able to get like good 5s on the field. Like getting Holy Sue and getting Jolong on the field is definitely good. But when you go Jokel, summon out Solfador, and you get immediate value out of the first 5 that you summon, I think is really good. Along with the fact that unlike the VS K9 deck that we'll touch upon later, this deck can bridge really fluidly between engines. So if you start with the K9 engine, you can bridge with the Infinite Attack River Stormer into the Crystron engine. And obviously the Crystron engine naturally has level 5s in it. And there's numerous ways to get 2 5s in the field to bridge into your K9 engine.
Yeah.
So I think this almost seems like what last format was like Ryzeal Mitsurugi, where you had like ways to connect the engines very seamlessly. So I think we saw that having success last format, and now in this format, I think this deck will likely have success. Something to note is that last format, there was a lot of issues with Crystron, being rather poor into cards like Lancia, or Chaos Hunter. But with how predominantly K9 focused this new version is, and how small the Crystron cards are, that issue isn't, really present as much anymore because you're still able to put up significant numbers of interactions throughout, Lancia withstanding. And if your opponent activates Lancia, then you start turning on the additional effects of the K9 cards. So it almost plays into your favor because you just go so far ahead in card advantage. Another card to note is while we are in this diverse metagame, Chaotic Elements is a really nice card in this deck that positions it really uniquely into the Ryzeal decks because Detonator is still a fantastic card that trades really well into a lot of these other cards. But Chaotic Elements has a neat effect where you're able to change of heart or snatch steal your opponent's Detonator specifically because it takes light pyros or dark aquas. So I think the fact that you're able to both search engine cards, but also 2-for-1 trade by taking an engine card and then turning it into a removal option for your opponent's detonator, I think positions it really strongly into the Ryzeal matchups. So that's something just to take note of when it comes to this deck.
Agreed. Yeah, I think it's still getting refined, very strong going first and board. I think going second is definitely like a little bit more of the choke point. But like he said, we're never able to juggle Summon Soulpit or instantly get that value compared to something like Xiaolong where you don't always get what you need off of it. I think it's a pretty strong strong deck and could see a lot of success moving forward. So
I
yeah,
think
next we
something else to
have...
note.
Sorry?
Sorry, just before we move off of like this specific deck, is when it comes to any of the K9 decks, you technically have more than just what we see as non-engine because Izuna being able to offer turn 0 plays, it just makes it so that you do actually have a lot more push going second than the typical combo deck.
Yeah, and it's also like those cards are good to draw for turn as well, so you're gonna have less conflicts when you draw something like a Veiler, like no, I drew Izuna, which is just an extender whenever they, especially in a K9 mirror where they're gonna turn those cards on pretty quickly. So another K9 deck, we've got the Vanquish Soul deck. This is the most hyped list. It performed very well at the EUWCQ. This is, I think, a pretty standard list in terms of ratios. We see 3 Jokel, we see 3 Izuna, 1 Lantern Lupus, and then the 1 spell. No case of K9, but the Quick Play spell is still there. And then some Fire non-engine cards that I've seen in both the main and side, Dogoran and Kurikara. Shifter in the main, this is a card I've generally seen in the side, but obviously very good card whenever it resolves. And then, yeah, the normal engine ratios. I've seen 1 to 2 Borger, but everything else pretty normal. Fua, Ash, 1 Nib in case they take the challenge. And yeah, extra deck, a lot of different options here. Paradise Smasher, fantastic card. So usually a card that I've seen a little bit just as a way to try and bridge the K9 cards into Vanquish Soul, because they're not an inherent bridge like you talked about with the River Tunneler. So this card, you just use your entire K9 package to draw 4, and usually by that point in the turn, they would have either drolled or impermed or whatever. So at that point, you're kind of hoping you're playing against a breaker deck and that the start usually going to resolve, and then if it does, hopefully you get a full Vanquish Soul package and get to keep playing. And then side deck, Phantasma is a card that is kind of taking the place of the Chaos Hunter, because it has a little bit more coverage. It's similar, like, not Chaos Hunter, probably closer to Perulia, where it's a little bit better into the Yummy deck. Obviously, it's still good against Maliss, and just like a good card, especially in this deck where like you need Dark Monsters. And then, yeah, just normal, there could be only one, which is another continuous trap card that we see coming up in this deck where every monster in your deck is a different type. And yeah, just normal stuff, Droll, Perulias for the mirror matches, and then just good going for spells and traps. What are your thoughts on this in the early format, Rehan?
So this deck obviously won the EUWCQ, so it was already really well, placing in the end of last format, and it only gets better from here, which is something that's not great to see because I'm not a huge fan of this deck. But this deck is definitely really strong. I think the results that it's seen in the OCG speak for itself. There's no silver bullet against it. It definitely has a lot of consistency to it, and then combined with like Holy Sue and Azuna, you have so many turn 0 plays where you don't really miss that lack of non-engine space. Because if you look at like, non-engine space, we have 1 Dogoran Kurikara Shifter, that's 3 Fua, 3 Ash, and then the 1 Nib. So when you're looking at like modern Yu-Gi-Oh, that's not what we consider to be great amount of non-engine space going second, but you still have so many answers to your opponent's plays when going second just with like engine that I don't think the deck really misses that non-engine space. I think it's probably one of the best decks of the upcoming format because it was already one of the better decks from the last format.
Yeah. Yeah, and especially if something like Droll and Lockbird isn't super prominent because we're defining it as a 6-deck format. If Droll isn't great against 3 or 4 of them, it's really hard to justify it as a main deck card right now. So another deck that just takes really good advantage of how the non-engine is kind of diverse right now and really hard to pin down. And yeah. So yeah, we'll see how this deck performs for Vancouver, and we've got the Dracotail deck. This deck has a lot of different variants. I couldn't find lists for everything off off of some searching. So this is, I don't remember exactly who. Let me see. Caitlin from Paisley WCQ. I think that's in Oz, if I remember correctly. And then so their list is 2 Pan and 2 Arugula just to try and up the consistency. This is more of a pure list with playing King of the Swamp. I've seen lists that play the Shaddoll cards, which is something that I've been testing. I saw a list by Steven Santoli, which was just pure no King of the Swamp, no Shaddolls, and was like Fenrir's and just a lot of good hand traps, with the goal of using Artholion to recycle everything. When you're playing King of the Swamp, you obviously get to take advantage of cards like Red Eyes Dragon, Dragoon, and Tyrant. And you have obviously the Spirit with Eyes of Blues and Spheres off of a normal summon with Lucius. You can go Lucius into Spirit, and then along with Artholion into make Spheres, which will get you into Malulu, which is just an interrupt on your opponent's turn. And then they play Donner for Contact C outs, and I believe Nib Token as well. Yeah. And then Typhon because you're playing a hand trap deck that'll most likely get into a grind. And then again, just good side deck cards. A lot of them are just going to be, like when you're siding hand traps right now, is most likely going to be some kind of a floodgate. So you see the Contact C for the Yummy deck, Lancia for Malice, Phantasme just to try and get into cards like 5 mana and all of the other good floodgate hand traps, Droll for Vanquish Soul and Ryzeal Mitsu. And then Warning just as like a generic going first card. Pretty good against every deck, and yeah. This deck doesn't take advantage of the continuous trap cards as much, so you're going to find something that covers everything. So yeah, what have you been testing with this, Rehan, and how are you viewing it moving forward?
I'm really happy we saved this for last because it's the best deck from Justice Hunters. Jokes aside, I think it really is such a cool deck. I'm a huge fan of the fusion mechanic. It has a lot of going for it. So similar to VS K9, where you have a lot of turn 0 plays, this also has turn 0 plays when you're incorporating cards like 5 mana. So 5 mana is the turn 0 quick play fusion when it uses the cards from hand or field. Most lists that I've seen now have started to incorporate Izuna as well, just because it's a monster that you can use as a hand trap. Worst case scenario is a body that you can use to fusion summon as well. So I've started to see a lot of that. For example, I think I've seen Julian Kihan also incorporate a larger K9 package into this deck as well. So like with Izuna's Jokels, because this deck does have like a 5. So there's like it's not the greatest synergy, but it's definitely playable. Where you're able to still use the K9 cards really effectively because worst case scenario they're bodies, best case scenario, you're able to go into like a secondary engine. We'll talk about I guess like the strengths and weaknesses of this deck a bit more when we're going through like the matchup spread. But I think this deck is really unique because it's really malleable into the format. So whatever the format demands of it, it can sort of adapt to. If the format is becoming something where it's a combo slop and you need to almost floodgate your opponent out, then it like for example like the version that we were testing with the Shaddoll cards, we can start incorporating turn 0 window plays. I think that this is probably one of the best Chummy decks that we've seen so far, just how well it can incorporate Chummies into its main deck. Because in a lot of the other decks, people argue that Chummies are good when they're discard outlets. But in this deck, you can almost trade your Chummy into another body if you use the big fusion, so the Artholion, to when it fusion with a Chummy in hand, and then instead just turn it into either a bounce or recover a resource from the grave. So I think it makes use of its bodies really well. And it makes use of Nib really well as well because you can threaten with a lot of different types of pushes on the opponent's turn, and then nib them or nib them after using your initial plays. So there's a lot of variations, like you said, with this deck, and I think this is one of the decks that will continue to evolve as the format progresses, because it died out a bit quickly in the OCG after some initial success, and a lot of that is due to how good the VSK9 deck forms into this. But I think this is something that will continue to evolve in this format, and I think it's really fun to play.
Sure. All right, Alex, we have given you the initial breakdown. What are your thoughts so far? What deck sounds the most interesting to you so we can make sure to change your mind by the end?
I think going historically from what I know of the previous formats, a lot of the decks weren't really like traditional Omni Negates based. A lot of the other decks they had all of these more like niche interruptions where they're like a destruction or guard a card from hand or like all of these like banishing, etc. So I think both the Crystron deck and the Yummy deck on paper makes sense to me. One, playing very well into hand traps, and that's also disruption. But two, also just being able to have that ability to generate those Omni Negates, because I think that's always one of the strongest ways to interrupt in any of this card game, or any card game generally. Just being able to negate any card your opponent has, be it the board breakers or their initial play. For me, I would lean more towards the Crystron cards because again, I think that deck Last format, I think the card quality is quite good. However, I don't actually think, at least in my opinion, I don't think last format you could fill a solid 40 cards with good high quality cards throughout. You rely on maybe some more of the non-engine and non-Crystron cards to try and get you there. But I think the Joker specifically really helps bridge the entire deck together. And for me, I think this deck could possibly just win Vancouver because of how much it not only generates those negates, but it bridges between both archetypes quite well. And you still have pretty solid amount of non-engine. There's 14 there,
Yeah.
which could be
Well,
increased
that's not
a
even
little bit
mentioning Azuna,
higher.
yeah.
Plus Azuna, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think this is one of the stronger decks. Obviously, I think the Vanquish Soul is just insane, but I wouldn't be surprised if the Crystron deck comes out of nowhere and steals the event.
Yeah, and the one thing you mentioned with the Yummy deck about having a lot of interrupts is like you with the Crystron deck, like you'll have like a lot of layers, right? Like you'll have like a pop, and you'll have whatever non-engine, and you can like. But the really interesting thing about both of these decks is you can layer your negates because like even if they Dark Ruler like your Yummy deck, you can surprise into tag out into like into Snatchy and then like make a Herald later. And in this deck, I don't think it's possible in the current builds, but theoretically you could maybe summon a Tristaros later and get to a Dawn Dragster. I'm not sure how possible that is, but either way, like being able to just like get Dark Ruler, okay, now I get a pop and I still get to rip your hand, and then I still have non-engine and I have this cluster card, which is a double pop depending on my hand is my turn. Yeah, a lot of different options, very strong decks. And yeah, let's look at the nerd numbers that we came up with. These are very rough. I didn't like Rehan filled out most of this for me, so much appreciated. I have my own thoughts on it. We're gonna go through it. We'll start deck by deck, and then we'll just see how it looks. So first of all, we're gonna go with the Mitsu Ryzeal deck. Obviously, mirror matches are gonna be 50%, and then these are the numbers that we have roughly down here. 75% plus in the green, 60% in the blue. Gray is gonna be pretty neutral, and we'll discuss what factors affect all of these numbers, maybe going up or down. And then we've got 40% in the orange, and then 25% or lower in the red. And obviously these are all rough numbers. Maybe it's closer to 30, but that's just kind of how we're trying to distinguish it all. So Mitsu Ryzeal into the mirror match. Obviously you're going to split into the Maliss deck 50%. Rehan, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think that number is accurate? What factors change that?
I think they're pretty accurate. The fact that you don't have specific silver bullets mained or even sided as much for each of the decks. It just seems more of a die roll focused matchup for me. I think if a detonator sticks, Maliss might struggle to break through it, especially because Bestials are becoming a bit worse. So initially, when you were playing Maliss, at least for like Nats format, you had several Bestials to counter a lot of the Mitsurugi cards. But now when Bestials don't make for excellent non-engine to a lot of the newer decks, I can see a lot of Maliss decks cutting those numbers down. Maliss still has Impulse going for it, which is really strong into depending on the type of Mitsu Ryzeal deck you have. I think it's like with Star and Cross and all that. But if it's like Cormac's variant, I think obviously Impulse isn't fantastic into that variant. But it can definitely cut off the Mitsu engine if it's in one of like the lighter Mitsu packages. But I think it's a 50-50. I think they're pretty even, more so of like a die roll and like card quality type of game.
Yeah, I think the factors that are the most relevant to me are, does your deck play pre-prep? Because if you play pre-prep, cards like Bestials in the Malice deck don't affect you as hard. And then also a card like Impulse. So does the Malice deck play Impulse? And it obviously plays Impulse, but like how many Bestials does it play? Is it still maining Droll? If it's not maining Droll, I think the Mitsu deck is going to be a little bit more favored. Obviously, post-side that will change, but like Malice's priority, or not priority, but like main strength historically has been its game ones, because it does not have to do with Lancia, so it can just play pretty freely. And then post-side, you always have to be concerned with it. So I think it's 50-50 currently. I could see it leaning maybe just a hair more in the Mitsu Ryzeal favor. Favor if you are playing like a pre-prep build. They're not playing too many Bestials and no Drolls in the main. So I think that's something that could happen. But if you're playing like a Ryzeal heavy deck and you get their maining Droll, then I think the Malice is definitely a little bit more favored. So those are the things I think are important in the matchup. Versus the Crystron deck, this is something I am the least familiar with. This is a deck I'm still pretty new to. From my perspective, I feel like the Mitsu Ryzeal deck is okay going second. If they're playing something like Droplet, I think it's like way better, obviously. If they're not, then I think maybe the Crystron's hard negates could generate some problems. But at the end of the day, X Ryzeal is a fantastic card. Aggregator and Valon just to interrupt with everything. It is really hard to justify that any deck that plays X Ryzeal is going to struggle going second. So yeah, we've got that. Vanquish Soul K9. This is, I think, historically pretty 50-50. Obviously, the UWCQ, it performed really, really well from the Vanquish Soul side. And with the K9 cards, it probably helps a little. Honestly, just only helps the matchup because you X and, like I said, Aggregator will turn things on. Habakiri will turn all those K9 cards on pretty quickly. Again, so if the Mitsu Ryzeal deck is not playing pre-prep and Futsu, I think they're going to struggle pretty heavily because those cards put up a lot of bodies, make it really difficult for them to kill you. And again, like if the Vanquish Soul deck, like we saw, is only playing 2 base shields or some are playing 0, then you're probably going to struggle pretty heavily into the Mitsu deck. Or not struggle, but like it's going to be pretty hard to clear all of the bodies. But again, if they're playing like a pretty Ryzeal heavy deck, then cards like the Board Wipes may just be a little better. And also that deck is a little bit clunkier in my experience, so that may be a contributing factor. And then we get into the Yummy matchup. So this is something I'm also not super familiar with. Rehan, have you tested it too much?
No, but when I close my eyes and I imagine my opponent dropping an X Ryzeal on me, I think as a Yummy player, I am terrified. Just because I don't think like the cards trade amazingly into Ritual Summon Murakumo from deck. I also don't think like if you back it up with like a strong engine push from the Ryzeal end, even if Yummy sets up their board, I know that it's very layered. You have bounces, pops, Book of Moons, but I don't think it's enough against a Mirakumo. And I think not having an excellent answer to Mirakumo, other than like Herald of Arclight, positions it, even if you have like your board made up, I think a strong engine hand from Mitsu Ryzeal can still crack it.
Yeah, so like you identified, Herald's a really big choke point. It's from deck or extra deck. It gets banished straight off that card.
Just hand.
Hand or deck. Sorry. So you can't do things like whatever summon ice. But yeah, if you go extend aggregator, you're going to be able to negate it immediately. Obviously, it cuts off something like Habakiri, so affects the consistency there a little bit. But as long as you have extra eyes on your deck, it's going to be really hard for me to fight against you, and especially if there's no draw unlock card in your list. So obviously, something like Purge is like solid, but if they're going second and have Purge in hand, if you lead Habakiri, you can't stop that. So you can still get into the engine like that. And then Mitsu Ryzeal into Dracotail. Not a matchup I have experienced too much, but again, it is really hard for me to think that Murakumo is going to struggle into any deck. Like, especially one that's trying to play a grind game. When you're forced them to discard cards, and especially a monster deck that needs cards in hand to fuse to gain value, I just can't really imagine that Mitsu Ryzeal is in favor, and especially when they have a card like X, send Valon, force one of the traps out, which already aren't great interactions in the matchup, in my opinion. I think it's going to be pretty difficult for Dracotail to consistently compete with it, especially if they're playing a more pure variant that is kind of trying to outvalue you. I think Mitsurugi is just one of the best value engines in the game with something like Futsu. It's really hard to compete with that. So yeah, this deck very strong across the board, no negative matchups, and like I said earlier, if there's no draw and lock burden in any of these decks, I think that the matchups only get more skewed in the Mitsu Ryzeal favor. Just so strong, and especially again, less base jewels, all of like the deck is just like well positioned based on the diversity of the format, where it's not being super targeted to just perform super well. So now we've got the old deck that should have won NAWCQ. Shout out to Aditya. So yeah, we've got Maliss, and again, we discussed this from the Mitsu Ryzeal perspective. From the Maliss side, I think, again, if you're playing Vicious, if you're playing Drolls, you've obviously got Impulse, which is really good into like the small Mitsu package. I personally prefer the pre-prep if you haven't noticed, but I think either way, the Maliss deck has a lot of the tools needed to counteract the deck, as you saw over the course of the past few months. The decks have been trading back and forth pretty consistently, and I think it's just a very strong deck. Crystron is a matchup that I haven't tested. It sounds like you may have it all, Rehan.
So based on my discussions with Santoli said that when he was playing the deck, for example, at like Rhode Island, he wanted to play as much Maliss as possible because Maliss was a favored matchup. I also just don't see Maliss ever winning going second against Crystron because Crystron trades really well into the fair hand traps. So cards like Imperm, Impulse, things like that, Ash, I think Crystron has a great time against. But when you set up cards like Cluster, when you have Forced Liberation, cards like that just remove bodies from the opponent's field, I think it's really difficult to push into a Crystron board. And I think Crystron can stun out Maliss with Lancia, whereas Lancia cannot do the same against K9 Crystron.
Yeah. I think, yeah, that all makes sense to me. This is a matchup that I'm still learning, like I said, from the Crystron perspective, and on testing platforms, it's not super common to see the older decks in the format. There's a lot of Justice 100 decks facing Justice 100 decks, so that's hopefully something I'll get to see in Vancouver if I don't get to test it prior. And then the Vanquish Soul K9 matchup from Malice perspective, I think this is honestly a little bit low. I think it's probably closer to Vanquish Soul favored. Just with cards like Holy Suit being so strong, And especially with the Earth count being so much higher with Azuna now, you can just take more often and not be required to get hit by a card like Impulse or Ash, which makes Holy Sue an even better interrupt. But I will say Malice going first has a pretty solid answer to Izuna in the form of Cryptor, where if you just set that up early, Lupus is not really an interrupt. And obviously Holy Sue is good, but if they don't open the correct attributes for it, it's not going to be super relevant as an interrupt. And like I also said, Ash and Impulse are just cards that the deck plays that can stop Holy Sue. So has pretty strong answers going first into the deck. Going second, I think it's pretty difficult to break a Vanquish Soul K9 board, but you do play enough hand traps that they're going to be okay. Like we discussed, the Borger and Caesar values count is I think pretty normal at around 3. So cards like Ash are gonna, or not Ash, but like if they're playing Imperm, pretty likely to resolve against it, and also not turn on K9 cards, so that's a benefit of them. Yeah, I think I would probably lean this slightly Vanquish Soul K9 favored, but there's definitely like non-engine considerations. Like if they're not playing Chaos Hunter in the side, then Malice is probably better because that is a card that I saw most Vanquish Soul lists playing in EWCQ because I recognize how difficult the matchup can be post-side. We get into Yummy versus Malice. I have seen a lot of matches, and Malice looks to be pretty favored. The game plan that a lot of decks are trying to do against Yummy is just like banish the field spell, and this deck does it really effectively. You're just going one body, make a link monster. Okay, now your Book of Moon isn't going to be effective when I summon one more body. Okay, you have to out that. Okay, summon another body. They have really, really layered ways of putting bodies on board whenever they open well. So that is something to be concerned with. So when you're the Yummy duelist, you have to be really aware of that. Maybe play a second minion or side a second minion, or at a minimum, just like always have surprise available to try and dodge the SP, because that seems to be the primary win con for that matchup from the Malice perspective. But it's pretty efficient, and it's obviously a lot of non-engine. And when you play a card like Impulse, you get to cut some of the tag outs, you get to cut off Herald. So I think Malice has a lot of good tools in the matchup, and Malice is like the king of whatever, like low, not even low to the ground, but like it can just play really well in the chummies. Until this deck gets hit, I don't see it. Like I think Yummy kind of wants to do what Malice does, just a little bit worse currently.
And then something else is also like within this matchup spread, probably Yummy is the only matchup where Bishos actually get value. So that's another thing that's going into that matchup. And then when we looked at some of the Yummy lists earlier, there's definitely Yummy lists that are just going all in on breakers. And I feel like if you're doing that, you just auto conceding the Malice, because Malice and board is just so layered that it doesn't matter like how many breakers you have. They like I don't think you can beat them with just breakers.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So yeah, then we get into Malice versus Dracotail. This is not a matchup I've experienced with, but and I will say the Malice's ability, or not ability, but like a lot of low to the ground non-engine. Like even if they're playing cards like Valor, they obviously play Imperm, they play Impulse. Those are all cards that are historically very good into like the mechanics that require a spell or an effect. So being able to Impulse a card like Femena seems really strong. So that's something that helps the matchup. But at the same time, and that also like when you have Arthalion, like that card getting Impermed is like really impactful. So I think the non-engine that Malice plays currently is like really favorable to Dracotail. But like the Bishos aren't going to get too much value, so like, there's definitely some trade-offs. But if I'm playing a pure Dracotail deck with like Valors and whatever Fenners, I think it's gonna be pretty hard to stop a Malice deck from just like fully comboing me. As long as like, especially if they open a card like Impulse, like you can just like let the deck play as much as you want, and then on your turn just like try and break their board with Asha Trap and then Impulse to Femena, and then alright, what did you really end on? It's like nothing super impactful. So yeah, we're gonna go into Crystron. This is again something I'm not super familiar with, but Alex is interested in it. So we'll see if we can talk him into playing this moving forward. Rehan, take me through this side.
So from Crystron's perspective, like I know initially I put it like Mitsu Ryzeal is a bit more favored into Crystron, but then by the time I made my way into this row, I realized that Chaotic Elements is still a card. So I would say it's about like 50-50. But I think when you just talked about Mitsu Ryzeal, I think still your matchup into Mitsu Ryzeal is not the greatest. But you do play cards like Droplets and Chaotic Elements, so like it could get there. I think it's just more of a who opens better non-engine type of game over here. But like I don't know. I think it's just like a combo deck versus a combo deck. So I will personally just thought it was an equal split.
Yeah, I think if it's 50-50, I'm gonna lean the deck that plays extra. So it's unfortunately that simple. And especially when Droll is not like if Crystron is not meaning the Droll and Lockboard card, I think it's gonna be pretty favorable for Mitsu as well. Like the cards that stopped that deck from being effectively tier 0 from my perspective are just not in the main decks right now. So I'm gonna just lean it in every situation where I think it's close. And then we've got Crystron into Malice. What have you come
just
from
a quick
testing
one
in this?
there, actually.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Just with the Crystron stuff, yeah. I guess the only other thought would be again, your talk on Silver Bullets post side. Lancia isn't as impactful against the Crystron stuff now, right?
Yes, 100%.
Whereas Droll is obviously turn ending in some cases against the Mitsu deck.
Yeah, that's
So I
a good
guess
point.
post side,
Yeah.
Post side you can consider that maybe the Crystron deck has a better matchup post side. If it can fumble its way through game 1 and get there, maybe it's good.
I mean, yeah, if you win the die roll and then post side, you just get to try and draw a one of those games. Like, you're in a pretty solid spot, right? And like both of them have said in the past, like the Crystron deck doesn't get silver bulleted like it used to by something like Lancia or something like Droll even. Like the K9 cards give you a lot of different avenues between Paradise Smasher and Ripper and the Quick Play spell. Like you have so many different layers in that deck that even if you get something like Fluid, like you can give a draw or two and just end up like a fantastic board. So I think the Crystron deck is well positioned. I think it has some consistency problems, a little bit of clunk, but very strong like end board pieces and non-engine options. So Vanquish Soul K9 from Crystron's perspective, I think this is very generous, Rehan. I'm probably a little bit more K9 Vanquish Soul favored. Obviously, you get to play K9 in both decks, but Vanquish Soul just is a way better deck going second from my limited testing in the matchup. It's really hard for me to think that Crystron's just going to like consistently win going second. I will say the Vanquish Soul deck doesn't interact with the graveyard too well, and especially if they're playing Bestials instead of a card like Pro, then maybe you can get some value in that way, but I just don't see any way how, like, not many decks are ranking the Vanquish Soul K9 board when it goes second. I can guarantee you Crystron isn't one of them. Like, it's just, I don't think even close. So, both of the decks have respectable non-engine. I think the Crystron deck that we saw is around 14 plus Azunas, so respectable number. Maybe it has the opportunity to stop it. But again, if a card like Droll or Peruli isn't in your list, I think the non-engine is just going to like not be super effective against the K9 deck, or the Vanquish Soul deck. We get into Crystron versus Yummy. I think this is also a little bit Crystron heavy. I would probably lean it a little more to the Yummy side from my limited testing. Like I was playing it with Droll in it, or not Droll, I'm sorry, Droplet. And Droplet was performing pretty poorly. Like even when I drew it, if they end on a Herald, like it doesn't do enough. So maybe if they open Obedience School, then Droplet is a little more impactful, then I could see it being beneficial. Maybe I need to try some different non-engines for that matchup. But overall, the Yummy interactions I think perform pretty well into any deck that plays K9. Like when they go Jokul, summon a guy, hook 2, even if you get the send off Sulfador, which there's no guarantee if they have a Herald, like do you even want to use Sulfador? I think it's a pretty difficult matchup for any deck that plays K9 cards into Yummy. And then the Dracotail versus Crystron. The Crystron deck does get to end on hard negates consistently, and the Dracotail deck does have some non-engine, or like some hand trap non-engine, but like we just discussed, the K9 cards perform pretty well into like the 1-for-1 hand traps. And then obviously, like now that there's less silver bullets against the deck, it's just harder to stop it. So unless you're playing like a good amount of breakers or just like have a really strong engine, I think it's difficult to break. And Dracotail, unfortunately, I think is neither. Like you're gonna play a lot of 1-for-1 trades and have like a respectable engine, but it's not gonna be like a super heavy push. You have 2 good spell cards, and then maybe 1 or 2 other fusion mechanics that you play. But overall, I think it's gonna be pretty difficult for that matchup to win consistently.
So what would you change the VS K9 and Yummy matchup to? So
I think it's probably 40-60 Vanquish Soul. It's probably close to like 45-55 in the Vanquish Soul favor. And then from the Yummy perspective, I think it's probably closer to 40-60 Yummy favored. That is my personal testing perspective. Obviously, could be wrong, but personally, I think it's more. Yeah, this is probably about right. I think the Crystron deck obviously is just like fantastic going first, but if it ever gets stopped going first, which to be fair may not, but I think there's like enough clunk in the deck for me to think that it's not just like an auto win going first. That going second, like it really needs to show me something else before I'm convinced that this deck is like a top tier contender personally.
Reasonable.
So yeah, we've got the Vanquish Soul deck. We've already talked about this from half the other perspective, so we can maybe be a little quicker. Vanquish Soul K9 versus Mitsu Ryzeal, I think 50-50, like we discussed. Non-engine interactions is going to be a really big player in this. How many decks are you maining Droll? Are you playing Bestials in your deck? Are you playing like Crows? Like how many of those good dark attribute monsters are you playing in your deck? If you're playing like a full K9 package in your deck, Murakumo is just going to board wipe you and you're going to go -2 in a deck that really needs the card economy. So it's going to be pretty difficult. I think Mitsu Ryzeal is probably slightly favored, but there's obviously a lot of ways for the K9 Vanquish Soul deck to counteract that in terms of their non-engine decisions. Versus Maliss, I think pretty close to 50-50. The Maliss deck obviously plays with cards like Impulse, that we discussed. I think this deck doesn't really have a bad matchup across the board except for Yummy. Rehan, what do you think the K9 Vanquish Soul deck can do to counteract that?
Just want to make a comment for the Mitsu Ryzeal matchup.
Oh, sure.
I think the Vanquish Soul cards are really good into the Mitsu Ryzeal matchup, but I think there's several instances where I've seen players just play pure K9, And if you're playing like pure K9 against Mitsu Ryzeal, like there's no contest. That game is over.
Yeah, dude, back him up.
So I think if we were looking at it from like the perspective of the spreadsheet, like it'd be a 25% matchup if you just don't open VS cards. So I think it's a bit polarizing in that matchup because it just depends on like the card quality you have and the access to engines. But anytime you don't have access to VS cards or are unable to like get into them or get that engine going, I just think like it's no context. Like Mitsu Ryzeal is just gonna win every single time.
Mm.
When it comes to I think Yummy, I've seen people try a few different approaches. I've seen people try Kaiju's, Kurikaras, try Bishos on the side to combat and like decrease the amount of like Izunas that they're playing. So they'll probably just play like Jokels, maybe like one Izuna, cutting down on the K9 cards going second. But I think the only reason that I think that Yummy deck is probably favored is because for the VS K9 variants that play a large K9 engine, the Yummy deck just never allowing those cards to get full value just makes it so that you're not playing your deck to its full capacity. And I think that's where the actual advantage for the Yummy deck is. Um, but I don't know what exactly VS K9 would do. I think the OCG is currently relying on Yummy to be the counter for VS K9, and I haven't seen anything break out from the OCG trends, so it's hard to say.
Yeah, I mean, as someone that's prepping for Worlds with Aditya, that is a deck that we've seen a lot of people qualify with over in Japan and in their Asia qualifiers. So, as we've seen, like this format has played out. Maxi is obviously uh, uh, it's like a distinguishment of that format compared to ours, but still a deck that performs well into Chummies and Maxi, half boards very well, and has a lot of non-engine to compensate. And then the Dracotail matchup, or sorry, yes, no, we talked about that. And then Vanquish Soul into Dracotail. As someone that has tested both sides of the matchup, it is rough. Rehan, you feel like sharing?
I went to a case tourney. I played 5 Dracotail in a row. I won once.
Yeah, it's.
Oh, I
pretty
mean,
rough.
I played 5 Vanquish Soul K9 in a row with Dracotail, and I won once. It is an awful matchup. The only solution that we've come across so far is Winda,
It's a
to
pretty good
like
one.
Floodgate.
Yeah.
Maybe draw, but like it doesn't matter like which part of the engine that they open. It is such a poor matchup. Your cards trade so poorly. And the biggest issue actually with this matchup is that when your VSK9 opponent starts playing turn one, the Dracotail deck doesn't have great board removal. It feels awful using Arthalion to bounce back attributes to your opponent's hand. So a huge part that you rely on is Grammel, I think. I forgot what the English name
Yeah,
is.
yeah, that's right.
Gulamel. You rely on Gulamel to like pop cards. Now the issue is that you have so many different chains that you can activate in VSK9 to interrupt that they're just never getting like any like issue getting the bodies to not to stick. So I think that's a huge issue. And then when you look at the interruption that Dracotail ends on, it being a spell negate, along with the bounce back to hand, they're not great against VSK9 because you don't want to be bouncing cards back to hand. So there's like an internal issue where like your engine actually just doesn't have any favorable trades into the VSK9 engine. So your VSK9 opponent can just open a card of like 5 engine cards and you just have a really difficult time stopping them.
And this is ignoring the fact that if they ever summon Holy Sue, you kind of just like scoop. Like there's no interaction into that card that the deck can create. Like maybe Fenrir helps and like that like does something, but at the end of the day, like that, if you can wait there, like you can let them play the Draco Tail player play their entire turn out, summon Holy Sue at the end, and like you just gain so much advantage off of it. If they end on spheres, you just like pop it with rosin, you pop their back row, like it just does way too much in one card. Obviously, not gonna happen every game, but the games that you do open it up, it's just an auto win. Like there's nothing that the deck can do to combat it. And then yeah, so we'll go from the Yummer perspective now. This is a deck that it has been pretty popular in the online circles lately, and probably a deck that I would expect a lot of newer, maybe not people like pretty accessible. I think it's like a good deck, and people enjoy the aesthetics of it, which is not my preference, but you know, it's whatever. So we have it probably a little bit lower than the average person. Rohan, how about you go across the board and see if we can convince Alex on this deck or convince him against it?
Okay, so Yummy versus Mitsu Ryzeal, Murakuma. Unless you have an answer to Murakuma, your board's getting wiped, your hand's getting ripped, and I just don't think you can stop the onslaught of Ryzeal cards within the engine. So I think there's a huge issue where even if you full combo, you really don't have great answers into the Ryzeal cards or the Mitsu cards. And I think that's an issue for the deck. So same thing with like how favorable the Mitsu Ryzeal deck was into Yummy. I just don't think Yummy's great. The other issue is also, we talked about Droll, but if we looked at some of the earlier Yummy lists that we looked at, especially the Breaker versions, but a lot of them also have started to play Songs of the Dominators. So if you play against Yummy and they're playing Songs of the Dominators, that means they cannot Droll you. And so now you're playing Mitsu Ryzeal with no fear of Droll. And so I just don't think like when it comes to deck building that like that's such a big issue that now you're playing a deck which cannot play Droll, and obviously I think that's just like a losing recipe against Mitsu Ryzeal. Against Malice, you're giving their Bestials value, you're giving Impulse value, and I don't see how you're stopping them because for cards like Obedience School, you have Impulse, you have Accode, you have the Bomber combo, which just keeps nuking your opponent's board. So every time you take a body, you just nuke them. You're banishing their grave, so Surprise loses a lot of value really fast. Um, and you have cards like MTP, Cryptor. So just sticking a body, just going second, seems like not a great time. And sticking your full combo through all the non-engine that Malice plays, which is actually favorable into you, I think is also not a great time. So I think it's really poorly positioned into both of the old decks. And earlier on, I think when Konami announced that they're not releasing a ban list until after Worlds, a lot of people realized that. And a lot of the people that I tested with, initially their hype died down for Yummy for YCS Vancouver because it is really easy to see how this deck can struggle into some of the older decks.
I would agree. Yeah, and then we get into more of the Justice Hunters matchups. I think the Crystron, Yummy has enough non-engine in its deck that it's probably going to be okay. And if you don't hard remove the bodies of Yummy, it's going to be pretty difficult, but the deck plays enough between Cluster and Infinity and whatever. Like, you have Don Dragster to check a card like Obedience School. So the going first end board of Crystron is pretty strong, but Yummy going first, I think, like, the way that interacts into the K9 card is very beneficial. So I think it's pretty Dyrel-centric. I'm not sure what the Crystron deck currently can do to kind of fix that. I think the Yummy deck just performs pretty well. It may honestly be, like, slightly Yummy favored, probably like 55-45 currently. And honestly, that number may not change for this time being, as long as the non-engine stays the same. So
I think Betty had a comment.
Oh, Alex?
Yeah, in my head, it makes sense for it to be a bit more Yummy favored, especially just because how the Yummy deck plays into the interrupts. It feels like it'll trade well into the Omnis almost.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I think Yummy's from the looks of it so far, it seems like the matchups are like one way or the other, which is kind of rare for a deck that I think has a lot of non-engine. Usually you try to like 50-50 it. But I think because of how diverse the format is, so we've got 6 decks listed here. And if there's any other ones, like decks from the old format, like the Ryzeal Onomatopoeia deck, whatever, like as the format gets more diverse, it is way more difficult for decks that have a lot of non-engine to tailor it towards what they want. So before, when you could just play Droll and 6 Chummies, the Mitsu Ryzeal deck kind of struggled because it was really to target that post-side you put in Lancia Chaos Hunter. Alright, Malice is going to struggle. But now the format's a lot wider, it's harder to... And there's also like more mechanics in the game, like we're back to having a fusion deck, so that card like Barry looks a little bit better. I think it's really hard to like align your non-engine across the entire board, because when you have a card like Purge is something very similar to Ash, but a card like Impulse is just a completely new card that does a lot more for a deck like Malice compared to something like Purge. So yeah, I think the Malice deck obviously positioned very well, and Yummy, it's going to do okay in some matchups, but I think it also has like some pretty negatives. And if you're ever playing against a deck that has breakers in its main or side, which a deck like Crystron can, not currently maybe, but like in the future, I think that could potentially shift the matchup in the end of the breaker deck's favor. And then we've got the Vanquish Soul K9 deck. We talked about this a lot from the Vanquish Soul's perspective. And Yummy, just in any deck that plays K9, it's going to perform pretty well. And then Mirror Match, and obviously the Dracotail matchup, we haven't touched on this one yet. So Rehan, what are your thoughts?
Oh, thank you. Unplayable. If you sit down and your opponent fusion summons a monster, just pack it up. There is no winning that game. It doesn't matter what you have. There is like absolutely no way Yummy ever wins this matchup, and anybody that says otherwise is lying to you. But like I think outside of Herald of the Arclight, the Yummy deck just doesn't have great answers into board removal. Something that's really cool about the Dracotail deck is that we touched upon how cool Arthalion is when it comes to the boss monster, which bounces. We talked about how cool the quick play fusion is, but something that we didn't touch upon is our cards like Pan, Urgula, and Malulu, which are the main deck dragons that all have their effects to place, but then they also have a bonus effect that's non-targeting. So going second, you just get so much more value out of these cards, when you're leading with like their branded fusion, which is Rahu, or you're leading with the Roha, which is Keto Dragontail. You just get so much more value when it comes to board removal that I just don't think that Yummy can keep up when it comes to this. And then you loop a card like Nibiru, which is also really difficult to deal with.
Yes.
So because of those types of interactions, when it comes to removal, Yummy's removal of popping, of booking monsters, and shuffling or banishing a card from the grave just isn't good into any type of fusion deck, whether it be branded Dracotail or just Dracotail in general. You basically are just entirely reliant on your non-engine or making a Herald of the Orange, Herald of the Arclight. And when it comes to Herald of the Arc, like you're in such a weird conundrum where you have a negate, but you almost are forced to keep it on the field because it applies a lot more pressure of looping cards out of your opponent's hand with its shifter-like effect. So you want to keep it up for as long as possible, and so they almost use Arclight as a floodgate in that matchup rather than an actual negate. But when you start playing cards like Shaddoll Fusion or Branded Fusion into the deck, I just think you have so much more gas to break through a Yummy deck that I just don't think Yummy can ever keep up, hence the 25%.
I think that's fair. And then we've got the Dracotail deck last but not least. Maybe the lowest win rate percentage so far between that and Yummy. It's one of the two. So the Justice Hunters decks are good, but it's really hard to justify them over some of the older decks. Like when you look at it as like a full format, when you look at it in the bubble of like just the Justice Hunters decks, I think it's a way more interesting format. So yeah, we got Dracotail into Mitsu Ryzeal. Again, it's really hard for me to justify that a deck that doesn't play Impulse is going to be able to like trade favorably into Murakuma, especially if they play Futsu in their deck. Like, good luck. Like, okay, well, I'm just gonna have 7 cards at the start of my turn, and you have to kill me. And Dracotail isn't the most efficient at OT King, so if they ever layer anything at all to stop you from killing them, they're just gonna start their turn with 8 cards because you bounce 3 of them and they search 4. So like, good luck. And that's obviously ignoring all the Ryzeal aspects of the deck that are very strong. We get into Maliss. This is a matchup that you seem to have a little bit more experience with me, so please tell me about it.
I think the matchup's actually pretty even. When you're playing cards like Nib is decent into Malice. But the issue was previously you try to pair it with hand traps and it wouldn't work. But when you're pairing it with a card like Femena, you can just remove bodies off the board, and then they try to extend with their actual extenders, and then you nib them, or you nib them and turn into Link Spider, and they continue to try to extend, and then you go into Art the Lion, bounce everything back. So it's really easy to play on the opponent's turn, and I think just Malice just doesn't want you to play on their turn, especially when it comes to removing bodies, and I think that's where it struggles. So going second, I think Dracotail has enough non-engine space and turn 0 plays where it can definitely disrupt Malice. But this is where a card like Impulse gets value, right? Because if you start with Art the Lion and then nib them, they can impulse your nib now, right? And the same thing when you start with nib and then try to find mana later. A card like Impulse is so unique where this is the only matchup where it's really difficult to pair those type of cards. The other consideration to make also is when it comes to both the the Dracotail versus Mitsurugi Ryzeal matchup, along with Dracotail into Malice matchup. Dracotail's the only deck in this format right now that can loop the silver bullets. So anytime it becomes stabilized and the game state becomes something like you just don't die, you can loop Lancia, you can loop Droll. And then it's really difficult for the opponent's deck to actually get back in the game because you're continuously looping your engine, you're looping the non-engine silver bullets, and you're continuously trying to floodgate them. So my experience with the deck into Malice has been pretty good. But like you said, Malice is one of the few decks that is still playing a lot of those 1-for-1 hand traps. So they can definitely have hands where they draw, Imperm Veil or Ash, and then you'll shut down and choke you out of engine, and then you'll just start their engine. And your actual engine disrupts are not amazing, especially because a card like Lingeribo exists. So since both of your traps are obviously just traps, you can definitely just check them with Lingeribo. And I think the going first potential for Dracotail into Malice isn't amazing because of that.
Yeah, I think that's a good assessment. So Dracotail into Crystron, not something that I've played too much of. I think it's just pretty hard to justify that Crystron's going to struggle, or like Crystron's like just overwhelming amount of going first power won't just like stop Dracotail. And like we've discussed, it plays through Floodgate hand trap super well. So even if you try to loop like Veilers against it, or even like if those are the non-engine of choice in your deck, that thing's gonna be pretty difficult. Maybe if you're playing like Azuna in your Dracotail deck, that helps a little bit. But overall, I think I haven't really seen the Crystron direct struggle going first ever. And then going second, if they do things like bounce and you still have those resources available, and the Crystron deck, like you can now send them to summon Solfefnir or Solfador. I think it's probably pretty. I think 40-60 is probably about appropriate. And especially if you're playing a card like Droplet in your Crystron deck, like being able to stop Arthurline on your turn, pretty favorable for you. And then post side, I don't think there's too many silver bullets either way, so I don't think anything is really going to change too much on that end. And then Dracotail versus Vanquish Soul K9. This is pretty difficult to play from Dracotail's perspective. Like we said, Holy Sue is just like, it's a silver bullet that is in-engine and searchable, so there's not much you can do about it. The Dracotail deck has obviously like Arugula to help counter the trap, but they can just do everything in their hand whenever they feel like it. Like your deck doesn't have ways to interact with it. There's no like Appaloosa or like a negate type effect that some fusion decks may have. So like whenever the Vanquish deck is not floodgated and they open engine, they're just able to bounce and do everything whenever they feel like it, and nothing you do is applying enough pressure to like really be forceful. And then yeah, Dracotail and Yummy, like you described, fusion monsters are just fantastic into it. Please take over.
Oh, I was just making a comment on the VSKN matchup. Is a bit of what we've seen in the OCG is Dracotail being combined with like a heavy branded engine. And I think that makes up for some of the deficiencies for Dracotail, because something that I alluded to earlier was Dracotail's inability to actually remove bodies on turn one. But when you combine it with the power and the gas of like the branded engine, I think that would be the only variant for branded Dracotail versus the VSK9 where like that matchup isn't just so one-sided in favor of VSK9, because the branded deck definitely has enough gas to actually counter the engine pushes of VSK9. But I don't know how that adapts for the TCG. That is probably something that we'll see develop over the Justice Hunters format. But that would be like the only version of Dracotail that I think can actually counter VSK9 properly.
Yeah, Mirror Jade performs pretty well into Vanquish Soul historically, so yeah, please continue.
Yes. And then into the Yummy matchup, it's just so easy to actually remove their bodies. So going first, going second, we talked about how well the Dracotail deck performs going second. But when you set up going first, you're setting up an answer for Obedience School. You are setting up multiple ways to actually remove bodies, whether it be to Arthur Lion, whether it be through Gulamel, or the Dracotail Horn. So since your opponent is normal summon reliant, usually unless they're leading with a spell, so you check multiple points of interaction when it comes to the Yummy deck into you. So I've definitely seen discussions where people feel that Yummy going second into Dracotail is more favor than Dracotail than Yummy going first into Dracotail. And I just don't think that's true, because this is the only matchup where when you go full combo, you check all of their engine pushes, right? When it comes to their spell extension, when it comes to their normal summon, and any other type of extension that they may have, you check multiple points of their engine pushes. So I think that would be the only matchup where going first, Dracotail feels like it has a solid board.
Yeah. Like historically, being able to like choose to go second post side has been something that's been like pretty interesting. It's not something that's been super relevant as of late, but I've definitely seen instances of it last format when there were like 6 chummies in your deck and whatever. If you played like a breaker, then you tell your opponent to go first, and their deck's just like substantially worse. And I think this is a situation where Dracotail like is very comfortable going second against the Yummy deck, but like choosing to go first is obviously just like way better, because the Yummy deck isn't really built around chummies to the same extent. But telling a breaker deck to go first post side is just fantastic. So that's something you can definitely take advantage of. So look at the Yummy list when you're the Dracotail player and just pick what everything is best. Alrighty, Alex. What questions do you have? How do you feel? Do you feel prepared to play Yu-Gi-Oh after that discussion?
I guess for me, it's if you're going into the YCS next weekend, YCS Vancouver, why would you choose one of the new Justice Hunters decks over something like Mitsu Ryzeal or Maliss? Besides the main thing, it's a new deck. People may not know exactly what's going on.
Yeah, so yeah, knowledge is definitely one of them. Like, will my opponent play super well into any of these decks? Who's to say? I think a deck like the Crystron deck is maybe one of the more interesting ones, because when I personally have done videos and then other content creators have done videos, the Crystron deck outside of Yassine is like not one that's discussed as much. So that's definitely a deck that you can maybe take advantage of, people not knowing interactions of. But yeah, overall, like, I think it is very difficult to justify something like, we'll say the Vanquish Soul K9 deck because of its going second potential. It's just overall power level. Like, that is like a deck that performed well pre Justice Hunters. So why would it not translate post? Very difficult to see why that is the case. And then obviously Mitsu Ryzeal and Maliss, whenever they're targeted less, are going to just perform even better, right? Less Chaos Hunters inside, less trolls in main. Those cards just seem fantastic. So if you are wanting something new, obviously the Justice Hunters decks are all viable. Like there's a reason they're all on this list, and none of the decks have super consistent bad matchups across the board, right? There's only one
Yeah.
25% matchup on a couple different decks. So maybe a deck like Dracotail currently isn't the best choice because of how polarizing some of the matchups are. But I think anything that is like 50, 40 or 50 across the board, like Crystron, the Vanquish Soul K9 is going to be solid. And the Yummy deck, maybe you can find ways to counteract all of these decks, or all of the older decks. Maybe you find a hybrid build with like Chummies and Breakers. Maybe you find just like Droll in the main is still good enough, and then like you side a heavy Malice hate post side. There's probably ways to do it. Me personally, I would probably be taking either Vanquish Soul K9 deck, Crystron, Mitsu, or Malice. I'm the least experienced with Malice, so it would be probably one of the other three. That is my perspective. I would like after playing a little bit with the Mitsu Ryzeal deck, I just think that deck is as always fantastic, and as it gets targeted less, it's going to perform even better. Has a good grind game, has a lot of good going second cards in the form of X Ryzeal. So I'm really a big proponent of like the going second engine decks, and Malice doesn't really have that. Mitsu Ryzeal has X Ryzeal. The K9 decks obviously have Azuna, and then a card like Floisu in the Vanquish deck. So those would be my preferences. Any deck that plays Breakers right now is probably not my preference as well. I just think, like we've discussed, how strong the old decks are. You can't just expect to activate a Dark Ruler no more and win the game. Like there's maybe some niche situations for like a Book of Eclipse to perform well. I think there's definitely Breakers that can be okay. But if your game plan is to enter a tournament with Thrust, Dark Ruler, Droplet, and hope to break a Malice board or a Mitsu Ryzeal board, I think it's going to be a really difficult tournament for you. So what the attributes of the deck that I want strong engine. I don't want to rely on my non-engine because in a deck like Yummy, I think having 16 to 18 non-engine that you can't cater towards the meta is going to be really difficult when the non-engine is just like one-for-one hand traps. When, as we saw last format, we saw a lot of Chummies, we saw a lot of Drolls. The one-for-one hand traps weren't actually performing too well, and they were already just getting cut. So it seems silly to me to come to a format where like the power level is still insanely high. We just added more decks to it, and then expect that strategy to just like come back and be good. If anything, like, it's just going to make the old decks even better. So yeah, what are you thinking? If you were going to YCS Vancouver next week, what deck are you taking and why?
I mean, I think it's quite clear throughout the video. But for me, I think I would still lean towards the Crystron deck, just because again,
Yeah.
like I will always say, typically for these types of events, if you have a deck that's just come out, it's a little bit more fringe. You'll see great success with it. The Crystron deck wasn't very developed beforehand anyway, so I think that puts it just a little bit further ahead going into the Just Hunters format. Especially with, I guess, looking across the board, you see 50s, 40s. If you build your deck in a certain way, I think you can kind of cater towards that. Maybe you want to main deck Drawn Lockbird, for example, and then that could put your Mitsu Ryzeal and your Vanquish Soul matchups a little bit more favored, especially in that game one, which I think is arguably the most important game to win.
100%.
I do agree with you that I think the Yummy deck isn't quite best positioned right now. But again, in my head, like there should be ways to change that going forward. But maybe we have to wait until the Forbidden Limited list after Worlds. But otherwise, yeah, I think it has to be. If I'm not going for the brand new Crystron deck, really, then I think you have to go back to old reliable Mirakumo Turbo, and I think I would lean a bit further towards the European pre-prep build. Shout out Cormac as always. I think that deck. That's why I play for UK Nationals. Don't really know what was going on as much, but I found that deck was just so powerful. Having a lot more aggressive plays with Mirakumo, and you're just starting a turn with a really powerful ritual play push. It just felt very, very strong. And as you always said, X Ryzeal.
Yeah.
He's the guy.
What else do you need to do in the format, right? Like that's how I top nationals. It was just I played as many ways to search that card as possible, and it would perform really well for me. Alrighty, any final questions or thoughts before we send you on your way to play Yu-Gi-Oh?
To play Yu-Gi-Oh. I think for me, the only things are like, I guess in my head, I'm just wondering why why I guess these are only a couple of decks, but why aren't there more of the floodgates than people's side decks, like the actual traditional trap card floodgates? Just looking throughout a lot of these cards like Gozen Match and Rivalry seem like they would be very, very good into multiple of these matchups, especially where everyone's trying to fit in these K9 cards.
Yeah.
slap them both in. Maybe that's why these yummy players aren't doing as well. They need both of them in. Try to increase the odds.
Oh, something we forgot to touch upon when it comes to the Crystron deck, that's really cool and unique to Crystron deck, is that Crystron can actually rivalry lock you. It's a bit
Oh, with
niche.
Clockwork Knight, yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but
you play the Link one that searches Clockwork Knight.
so you search that and you get Clockwork Knight, so not the knight with a K, the knight with an N.
Yeah.
The continuous spell, and you turn everything on the field into a machine. So that stuns Malice
Oh.
into some plays like out of their extra deck, so they can't go into Splash Mage. And then
Yeah.
for against Yummy cannot go into their Link 1 because it requires a Light Beast. And if you happen to draw Rivalry with it, then you have a
The game
machine on
is
the
over.
field.
If you're not playing the mirror match, the game is over.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I agree. The continuous trap cards are fantastic. I think that's one of the ways that you can actually beat K9 Vanquish Soul going second. You like force a little bit of a board through. You try and remove the Caesar, and then you just like flip a rivalry or a goes. And like that's historically how those cards have been used
Yeah.
over the past few years. Like obviously good going first cards, but Labyrinth was just like setting trap cards and flipping them, and then hoping to have a strike for the negate. And it worked really well for a while. Like the deck was actually playable, and it was just off of the back of flipping continuous trap card and solemn strike. So I agree, those cards are good. In the Yummy deck, like cards like Storm and Dust are in there. You play Herald the Arclight. Like you have plenty of different ways to answer it.
Yeah.
Like obviously the Vanquish Soul deck can play like there can be only one. The Dracotail deck can kind of play Peekaboo maybe, but like I just think in general you want to prioritize just like the monsters in your deck. I think
The
the side
monster
deck of
cards,
just like
yeah.
12 monsters is fantastic. And even in my list, wasn't even setting like a going first warning. I was playing Fenrir in my list. I just like I wanted monsters in my hand like the entire game, unless I was searching them off of whatever my effects were. So yeah, we've got hopefully Yummy will perform well and prove me wrong. I've seen a lot of people perform or have been playing it. A lot of
Very
content
well,
on it out
yeah.
there. It's just the deck that I have the least faith in currently going into Vancouver. It is the deck that is probably one of the more interesting ones, along with Dracotail. The other decks seem pretty kind of solved in terms of like the ratios, and the gameplay is really going to define how they perform at an event. So yeah, any final thoughts before we close it out here, guys?
I think it's a really cool
Good luck.
format. I wish I was going to Vancouver because I think it'll be a really fun event.
As someone that played a lot of last year, I think this is a good good direction for Yu-Gi-Oh. A lot more interaction. The decks seem interesting, especially when we get a Forbidden Limitless, removing a card like Paradise Smasher, removing the power level of a card like Murakumo, just like whatever hits they want to do to those decks. I think that'll make the engine even better, or the game even better.
We just didn't cover Paradise Smasher.
Oh yeah.
So something that's really cool, and then we were talking about earlier, I think in another discussion.
The Crystron deck to do well, huh?
Well, I think it's for any K9 deck, right? So like you can, bring K9 Memento to YCS Vancouver. But when you're getting chummied, when you're playing as like a breaker yummy list, like you just cannot do that with Paradise Smasher so legal. Because any 5 combination will Paradise Smasher you. So I think that's just like a card that is kind of also warping the format in a bit. It's not just the existence of like Mitsu Ryzeal in the format where you can't play breakers. It's just the fact that if your opponent sees that you're not doing anything, or you get chummied, they're just gonna Paradise Smasher you, and it's like what 2 draws, and they Paradise Smasher you, and it's untargetable. So I think this card as well is something to keep note of because this is also, I think, in my opinion, also warping the format a bit.
Yeah, that's a good point. I completely spaced on it because it's like I said, prepping for World, not a card that I've been considering, and something that it's generally not a game plan that I go for just because people are playing so many hand traps right now that it feels like unreliable to some extent. Like if I just end on my K9 Vanquish Soul board of Trap, Quick Play Spell, Ripper, Rock, whatever in hand, like you're gonna win the game the same way. But yeah, like this is a fantastic contingency plan into a card like a Chummies and a Drolls. So it does have that going for it, which is just you can never really complain about VFD, right? Like preventing the battle as well just means like you can't out it. You have plenty of bodies to start your turn. Fantastic card. Hope it gets banned at some point in the near future, but we can't have everything we need. Alrighty, I think it. Sorry, what's up?
No, just see how it goes.
Yeah, I think it'll be a very interesting event. Wish I was going. I may try and do some coverage over the weekend. I think it's an interesting format. I'm looking forward to it. We'll see how it progresses going into Dude at the start of the next month. But yeah, thanks for watching, everybody, and we'll see you the next time.